As I'm sure you're aware, Argentina should literally be one of the richest places on earth. It's got incredible demographics, it's got natural resources, it's got oil, it's got gas, it's got the materials needed for renewable energy, it's got incredible demographics, it's an absolute breadbasket. It's in the Western Hemisphere. You know, you go back a century ago and you'd hear sayings like a person is as rich as an Argentine. Back then, Argentina vied with the United States for being the richest and most powerful place in the Western Hemisphere. It's not like that today, thanks to decades and decades and decades of horrible governance. All it takes for Argentina to catapult itself into the first world is mediocre governance. That's all they need because they've just got so much going for them. Will Argentina see mediocre governance in the next year, 5, 10 years? That is a big question because if it happens, we will see the release of a real estate boom, in particular in certain neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, like we have never seen in our generation. So, over the course of this conversation with Mr. Argentina Joel Bowman, we tease out what Argentina's prospects are for mediocre governance or better. I'm not looking for Switzerland. We have very mediocre governance in Argentina, and we will see an incredible real estate boom. In particular, Buenos Aires neighborhoods we talk about, and in the video, I walk through the where and the why of the opportunity as we tease through and talk through the big open question of what's Argentina's political future. Hey Joel, lovely to see you.
Ronan, good to catch up with you, mate. How you doing?
Great, great. I'm talking to you here from a park in Guadalajara. I see you're in your apartment in leafy Buenos Aires.
Yes, yes. I'm somehow sweating it out in an apartment in the middle of a megatropolis while you, as the host, is surrounded by verdant, leafy ferns and whatnot. So I've got this back to front, I feel like.
Well, this is quite the metropolis too here in
Mm.
Guadalajara, but I think it's a kind of a cool thing about big cities. And I know it's the same in the middle of BA that if you put yourself in the right neighborhood, you can be in a totally walkable city center and take the traffic out of the play. Because here in Guadalajara, it's a huge metropolis, 4 or 5 million people. The traffic is notorious, and that's all true. But my time here in the heart, it's all walkable. I'm walking 10 or 15 minutes or a $3 to $5 Uber, and it's quite idyllic.
Yeah, I shouldn't complain too much actually. About 10 minutes, which direction? 10 minutes that way from me on foot, actually maybe even less than that if you're walking at a brisk pace, is what are called los pulmones de la ciudad, which are the lungs of the city. And even for a city with sort of 12 or 15 million people, depending on where you draw the parameters, the air notoriously, or famously, I should say, is very clean, Buenos Aires. And it's largely due to this huge run, miles and miles of parks just behind me here that suck up all the pollution and give us these beautiful, bright, sunny days
Yeah, yeah,
that we
yeah.
enjoy.
Yeah, wow, great. Here, again, this is just general interesting context for folks who might want to visit. Here, when it comes into March, April, May, for me, it's not a good time to be here. It gets hot, it gets polluted. You often have fires in the mountains around. Air quality isn't good. But for probably 8 months of the year, we just have this beautiful weather, lovely, lovely clear air, certainly in the heart. But Joel, that's not what we're here to talk about. So,
Literally
Joel,
shooting the breeze.
longtime friend, longtime friend of ours here at RETA, is in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in the heart of a grand experiment. So maybe, Joel, if you could quickly, for those new RETA members who maybe aren't familiar with you, if you could just bring us up to speed on your backstory, your ideological leanings as well, for context,
For sure.
and then we want to talk about what's happening on the ground in Argentina, in Buenos Aires in particular, and then for us to start to make, assessments and move along the line of understanding whether this could be one of the biggest capital city real estate buying moments of a generation.
Yeah, actually, well, thank you very much, first of all, Ronan, for the opportunity to speak to your readers, and thank you to your readers for taking the time, even this far, to have a listen to us. I think what's happening down here in Argentina, I've been calling it the greatest political experiment of our age, with a characteristic understatement for those who know my writing. But I really do believe that what's happening here in the kind of libertarian laboratory, that's Javier Milei's libertarian laboratory, is exceedingly interesting, not just for people who are watching from on the ground here, as I'm doing it from the capital in Buenos Aires, but for those around the world who have been sort of told throughout their lives that big government is here to serve them from cradle to grave, and without their intellectual and spiritual benevolence, we would all be without the proverbial pot to piss in. I hope I can say that on your
You
channel.
can say whatever you want.
So careful. But yeah, so what's been happening here essentially since the end of 2023 is that there's been a self-described anarcho-capitalist, at least a philosophical anarcho-capitalist, in the Casa Rosada, which is the Pink House, Argentina's equivalent to the White House. And he has taken, I'm sure your readers are familiar with, his textbook chainsaw first policy to the Argentine economy. Now, the Argentine economy had about 75 years worth of bloat and bureaucracy in it, so there was plenty to cut back. And he's basically gone sort of full austerity measures on the public sector down here, trimming it back, a zero tolerance to deficit spending. He's outlawed money printing for political purposes, and trimmed, at last count, and this was actually just earlier this week, I was checking the figures, 60,000 public payroll jobs have gone, and many more are sort of on the chopping block. What he's really done is concentrated on transferring that big lag on the economy over to the private sector and sort of giving it a revitalizing boost. And so we have a huge surge in private enterprise, big numbers in foreign direct investment. The country risk has come down. There's a bunch of statistics that perhaps we can go through during the course of this conversation, but all is to say, for a card-carrying and unreconstructed philosophical anarchist as sits before you, it's been a very, very exciting experiment, to say the least. And as we'll probably get into, we just came out of the midterm elections here in Argentina. So after a couple of years of the long-suffering Argentine people witnessing what President Milei is doing and the kind of results that he's delivered on a number of fronts, they voted him, gave him a huge mandate in the midterm elections, which was a really, really resounding defeat for the Peronists, who had had the country in a kind of stranglehold for 3+ generations here. So we've seen this really, really depressed market that is, had been an economic basket case until a couple of years ago, sort of returned to the global stage. And we can kind of get into talking a little bit more about that, but it's really an exciting time to be here. That's for sure.
And I suppose, Joel, the context for everyone as well is, I mean, Argentina should be the United States rich. Argentina is blessed with resources. It's blessed with wide open spaces. It's a breadbasket. It's got oil, gas, mineral reserves. It's got one of the most robust demographic structures on Earth. So the formula is there. It's got limited security risks, even though things can get pesky periodically with some neighbors. But it's out of the beaten track, and it really is uniquely poised that once the circumstances are right to take a massive leap forward. Another thing I love about Argentina's potential as well is the diaspora is everywhere. They've panned out right across the globe. They're smart, they're hustlers, they've done really, really well. If things were to turn back home, we would see a mass influx of Argentines returning home. And that would just be fuel on the fire of an already strong real estate market in that scenario. Interestingly, for Ireland's economic miracle, what we saw in the early 90s, that thing of diaspora returning was one of the huge trigger events to our real estate boom. Joe, just an interesting thing by way of context. And I think this is an interesting place to set up. How would you compare Norway with Argentina in terms of governance? And I'm kind of making this
Yeah.
point because, you know, sometimes with the leftists in Central and South America, they kind of talk a language that might in some ways seem consistent with, say, Scandinavia, but then the reality is a kleptocracy, not an ideological interest. So I'd imagine with, say, a Norway, you could say, right, ideologically, I'd go a different way to these people, but they're kind of competent at what they do. But here it's a totally different story. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I always feel it's a very important point to make that
Mm.
sometimes people confuse ideology that they might be sympathetic to and get sucked into it, whereas the reality is, in terms of the execution, is a kleptocracy.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up Norway. I spent a lot of time there. My
Yes,
wife was
I'm.
born in
Yeah.
Norway, and yeah, we were there just this last year, actually. I mean, look, absolutely wonderful place, breathtaking scenery, of course, lovely people. Everybody's better looking than people that you see around you every day. It's just a good, clean, healthy place to be. And of course, they have the single largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet. So it's essentially a Scandinavian petrostate, right? So they have exceedingly generous social welfare benefits in the same way that Kuwait has exceedingly generous welfare benefits. But of course, we don't see anybody arguing for a theocratic autocracy based on literacy rates and access to private or public education and public healthcare. So, it's a little bit, I find disingenuous when people talk about the so-called Scandinavian model as being some kind of panacea, it's this big kind of, Mamdani's, socialist dream come true. What actually happens there is that they have 2 million barrels of oil production per day shared among about 4.5 million people with a very, very homogenous culture, a fantastic work ethic, and there's just a lot of oil to go around for a very, very small population. So it's often putting the cart before the horse when people look at a small petro-rich state and say, well, it must be because they spend a lot of money on social welfare programs. Well, social welfare programs lies in the cost side of the ledger, not the profit side of the ledger. When you dig a little deeper into the numbers, and this goes for a lot of the Scandinavian, sort of so-called miracles that Bernie Sanders and AOC like to bang on about, they're actually very, very free markets. They have a high respect for private property. The ease of doing business is, ranks among the highest in the world. They have very, very strong rule of law. They have private ownership of the means of production. When it comes to generating capital, they are capitalist countries. They just happen to be very, very well endowed with when it comes to natural resources in the North Sea. And so they can choose to spend that around the way that they wish to. Down here in Latin America, we've had governments come up which, as you say, much more overtly resemble outright somewhere between a kleptocracy and an ineptocracy. I just kind of hybridize those two, but yeah, just theft and corruption and grift and fraud at the grandest of scales. And for 75 years, basically since the 40s, when Juan Domingo Perón first darkened the doorway of this fine country, it's been one ill-advised economic experiment after another, with periodic episodes of hyperinflation, if not outright currency collapse. It's spent more time in the proverbial poorhouse than any other country, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but I believe on Earth, as far as it comes to defaulting on debts in the past, in the modern era. So it's just been an absolute basket case. And when somebody like Milei comes along and says, we have an enormous amount of potential here in this country. We have the vaca muerta, which as of August is already up to producing half of Norway's daily barrels per oil. So Norway, as I mentioned, is about 2 million barrels per day. The vaca muerta is ramping up production under a much friendlier market economy down here, and we're seeing it closing in rapidly on 1 million barrels a day. It was about 900 some odd in August, and we expect that to ramp up considerably over the coming months and years as more foreign direct investment pours into the country. Likewise with natural gas. Argentina has huge fishery industries. It has obviously agriculture with soybeans, the famed beef de chorizo, which I'll be having for lunch in about an hour from now. It has wine production. It has lithium. It's a strong member of the lithium triangle, so-called, up with Bolivia and Chile in the northwest of the country. And Bolivia, as your readers may know, just had somewhat of a watershed election of their own, tossing out their sort of militant leftists and bringing in a more market-friendly fellow there. So we expect, as markets continue to open up here, that Argentina will be the beneficiary of exactly the kind of honest trading information, i.e. price, velocity, demand, supply, all of those pieces of information that are critical to running an economy well. And we're going to see, I think, one of the strongest success stories that I've certainly seen a setup for in as long as I've been paying attention to geopolitics and human folly and hubris.
Yeah, and Joel, as well, for our RETA members and for kind of for context, there is so much more to Argentina than this macro story. This is, Buenos Aires is a world-class city. It's an incredible place to be. It's extremely livable, amazing food, great quality of life, fabulous old historic apartments. So this is where things start to get interesting when we see the kind of the lifestyle components of the Rita beat line up with a potentially incredibly exciting macro story. Can we go to Buenos Aires and buy an apartment for 300 or 400 grand that we'll love, we'll get to enjoy, we'll get to spend time, and we'll wake up in 10 years and it'll be worth 1.5 million, or it will converge with other world cities. Now, I asked Kim Iskian to go down there to check it out a couple of months ago, and he wrote this standout line which really grabbed me, which, he described sitting in a cafe and drinking coffee at New York prices and looking around and seeing real estate at 1970s New York prices. So, what's happening to prices of basic stuff? Is the economy creating capacity to release more stuff? Where are the bottlenecks? Where's the capital coming from? Um, just what's going on in that kind of day-to-day living stuff?
Yeah, well, props to your editor, Kim, there. I read that report. It's a fantastic line. New York prices at 1970s, New York coffee prices, 1970s real estate prices. And he should have also mentioned 1980s haircuts. That's sort of ubiquitous here. And the Maradona mullet is still alive and well down on the Pampas. Um, uh, I'd say with regards to that, he's absolutely right. Of course, it's I was in a cafe on Libertador, which is a big grand boulevard near where I'm talking to you from today in the Palermo neighborhood. Little cafe Tabac. It's one of those old school sort of gentleman type cafes where the waiters wear bow ties and everybody sort of sits in the sun and looks at the jacarandas and fans themselves. And your coffee comes out, it has a little cookie and a little beaker of sparkling water, and it's all very civilized. But I was quite shocked at 8,500 pesos for my coffee. That's about it's a little over $5, maybe $5.50. And I told my Argentine friends who are visiting, they live in Portugal, and they said, as you would know, well, Ronan, that's about double what you would pay
Yeah.
in Lisbon. Your editor is not wrong in noticing that coffee shops, things like this are very, very highly priced on a world scale. On that kind of, you'll remember the Economist Big Mac Index. There are
Mm,
certain things that are kind of maxing out, and that happens periodically with this country because largely due to fluctuations in the peso, in their currency here. It goes from sometimes the cheapest country in the world to the most expensive country in the world, and that can happen in a matter of years. What I expect to happen there is we're going to see continued strengthening of the peso going forward. It was the strongest performing fiat currency on the planet last year in 2024, after being the most inflated currency on earth in 2023. So it literally went from the poorhouse to the penthouse in a matter of about 18 months. So with that, we've seen basically we've gone from a hyperinflationary period where you would go and sit at that very same restaurant and order a cup of coffee, and the price would change by the time you sat and drank your coffee. So there are no numbers on the menus, no prices on shelves at the store, that kind of thing. To an economy that is in a period of adjustment, and that adjustment shows up in restaurant prices. It shows up in kind of everyday consumer goods. But what we have seen over that period, and we're starting to see this really come to the fore now, is a disinflation. That is the rate of inflation slowing, not quite going down, but it's gone from about 25.5% per month at the end of 2023, which is 300% per year, which is kind of eye-watering level of inflation. Down to there was a readout yesterday that I haven't taken a look at, but it's about in the 2% range per month now. So it's about sort of high 20s per year. And we're going to see private forecasts as well as the National Institute of Statistics index here thinks that we're going to see it at 1% by the end of the year, and possibly some deflation. So I think that those everyday prices are probably going to start coming down, both in peso and dollar terms. But as for the real estate, which is, I think, the real sort of beat for your RETA readers, we're entering a phase now where all of a sudden there are credit lines. All of a sudden, people who had been holding cash, tangible assets, land, precious metals, crypto, whatever, they are now seeing their real estate market open up to new lines of credit. And so, as we've seen, even going through, decennial crises, even going through periods of hyperinflation and currency uncertainty and political unrest. We're now seeing some political stability in the country such that interest rates have come down more, more, more than it looks like it could be possible on a XY graph. And all of a sudden, lines of credit are starting to open up. So people who had been sitting on sometimes multi-generation real estate properties here in the capital, for example, and who were trading them around that, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 range, are now looking at, a potentially huge flood of liquidity about to come in. So while we're still seeing those sort of 1970s prices, as Kim rightly pointed out, I think the future looks like, if we continue to see sustained growth and we see an influx of credit, we may be at the beginning of when the New York coffee prices come back down to something a little bit more mean reverted, and the 1970s real estate prices shoot up to something like what you might expect in a civilized world capital in the mid 2020s.
Yeah, so I guess Jill, like the core thesis, or my core thesis is, or the thing. I mean, it's not even a thesis. I think it's a racing certainty. If Argentina were to enjoy a relatively modest period of stability with okay governance, to the extent that, international confidence returns to, again, that this mightn't be confidence Switzerland levels of confidence, but it could be the levels of confidence international markets had in Russia in the 90s, or in the Nigerian oil industry in the 2000s. So I mean, this doesn't have to be Switzerland, but get at least half of the way, maybe 60% to Switzerland, and you're looking at just an extraordinary real estate boom, because the amount of capital, um, the amount of people, the fundamental demand that will be unleashed primarily on those prime Buenos Aires neighborhoods, will be just a massive needle mover. And this will also come at a time and a moment when there'll be very, very limited liquidity, because so many of those apartments are a bank for families. And, as values rise, people will just be very, very hesitant to sell. So this could be one of these moments and one of these scenarios where not only do we see massive appreciation of real estate values, but it flips straight into bubble mode. And bubble mode could be 7 to 10x gains. And what I love about this is we're also talking about apartments that RETA members will love to visit and spend time, and could make a bit of money in terms of short-term rentals. Not huge yields. Currently relatively modest yields, but it will generate a bit of pocket money. Um, so maybe, Joel, if we could talk scenarios. So first of all, Milei came into power with this agenda. He's just had his first big test. He's just had his first big test, in electoral test, in terms of this agenda. And how did that play out?
Yeah, so if I could, I want to get to that, but if I might just add a little context to an observation, I think a keen one that you made just then, with regards to perceived political risk. If Argentina just has a kind of mediocre government, if it just doesn't, do an Amber Heard and kind of go sideways there. But what we're talking about here is JP Morgan have a country risk index, which is a fairly well monitored index for international and institutional investors looking to deploy capital in various foreign jurisdictions. The higher the risk index, obviously the riskier the country. The lower the index, the better the investment. Argentina's typically around the 2,000 to 2,500 point range, which is basically in the don't touch with your worst enemy's capital because you're probably not getting it back. Um, After Milei came into power, we watched the steady collapse of perceived risk here in Argentina, such that it fell into the 700s while before this midterm election, which we'll get to in a second, there was a relatively small provincial election about a month ahead of this of Milei's big test, as you correctly put it, and I won't kind of get into the weeds on this, but the Peronists, that is to say Milei's opposition, did surprisingly well in that election, actually probably very suspiciously well in that election, and it spooked the markets to an extent that they saw maybe Milei wouldn't be able to push his agenda forward in the back nine of his first term here, and that might halt a lot of the progress that he'd made in the first couple of years. So the peso fell like a rock. The country risk index rocketed up. It was from 700, it more than doubled back over 1,500. Fast forward a month, and Milei romped it home in the midterm elections. His La Libertad Avanza LLA party had a sweeping win, including winning here in the province of Buenos Aires, which it hadn't held in, well, actually its party hadn't held, but it broke the Peronist stronghold, which had been going back, as long as anybody could remember. So with that resounding result, we saw the country risk index fall from the sort of 1,400 range back now, I think it's in the 500 or 600 range. So what that means is the green light now for international capital, foreign direct investment. It means that projects in and around the Vaca Muerta, oil fields that we were talking about just a minute ago, funding is being green lighted for those projects at, now it's basically just sort of turn on the hoses. What that means for local real estate, I think as a good case scenario you lay out there, we're talking about, we're not talking about a new build, if that's your idea. We're not talking about something that you might find in a Dubai, for example, or a Panama, or one of these cities where they're racing ahead to fill demand. We're talking about a city that is essentially an old world capital in a new world country. It's sometimes referred to as the capital of an empire that never existed. So we're talking about broad avenues. We're talking about Belle Epoque style architecture. We're talking about triple overhead ceilings and ornate moldings and cornices, and really the kind of buildings you would more likely see in sort of shishi areas of Paris than you would think to see in a Latin American capital. And they're not building any more of these in particular areas like Recoleta, like Palermo Chico, certain areas of Belgrano. So while you might get sort of new builds down in some other parts of the city, these big old, it's like walking through a kind of living museum in certain parts of town. The building I'm sitting in right now actually is a historic building, and we're talking about kind of old world grandeur that they're just not replacing. So you get in on the ground floor of something like that at these prices, and yeah, it could actually be a place that you might even want not to rent out because you might find it difficult to leave yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as you're talking there, I'm recalling an anecdote from my last visit to BA. I was having one of these lunches that you have with my lawyer down there, and he has an Irish name. And he speaks English with a very Anglo-Irish accent, the accent of an old, big landowner in Ireland. And he was dismissing the United States. He was there, me and my people, we came to Argentina, the big farmers from Westmeath. We came to Argentina. It was the poor farmers went to the United States. And it was just very interesting. We just have to remember that the Brits were there, the Italians were there, the French were there. They brought their architecture, of course. There's the saying, someone's as rich as an Argentine, and that's all reflected in the city, and it's still there, but there's a finite amount of it. So it's that scarcity that, really triggers that idea that if there's a play in Buenos Aires, it's historic apartments. Sure, as the city develops, you'll have high rises pop up, but all of those will have much lower supply constraints and also will have a cost, just a pure cost of creation that will exceed the current pricing per square meter of these old bricks and mortar. So that's the other thing for folks to bear in mind. You can buy these historic apartments for less than what it would cost to build a shiny new luxury condo on the outskirts.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Let me just add a quick little anecdote in there, Ronan, if I may. My family visited my sister, my mother and father a few weeks ago. They've been here many times. My wife and daughter and I, we've been here since 2010. And so they've visited us over the years. Anyway, I took them to some of the old bar notables, they're called, or café notables. These are notable historic buildings that, Borges and Carlos Gardel and what are called the immortals, Los Inmortales, would have visited and frequented during the kind of, cafe culture days of the 1920s and so on back in the day. So they're beautiful old ornate buildings. And one of them had recently undergone quite an extensive refurbishment during the COVID shutdown. Obviously, some investors with some deep pockets had a bit of money to put to work. And so they did a complete inside renovation of one of these grand old cafeterias down in the downtown district. And I was sitting there with my father, who is a builder by trade, and has been sort of tinkering on houses and renovating our own houses and so on and so forth throughout his life. And we were just kind of remarking on the craftsmanship and the workmanship of of this pretty impressive refurbishment. And at some point I said, "Oh, what would it cost to get this done in Australia, for example?" And he just looked at me and said, "Get this done? We couldn't get this done. We don't have enough master builders with the skills in this generation." My father's recently retired, but in the generation that are working now, the amount of people who know the old world skills to be able to, build these sublime buildings, they just don't exist. So you're getting a little slice of history that is really, I would say, almost impossible to reproduce, certainly on this kind of scale. So that's a little added benefit, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, scenarios, Joel, looking forward, what 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 pressures are this movement coming under from outside and from within? Let's remember also that many a movement started with a certain agenda, and there's a lot of snouts looking to eat off the trough. In particular in a country like Argentina, the pressure from within the movement, pressures from outside. Will they be able to stay the course? And then what does that look like, 2, 5, 10 years down the line?
Yeah, that's obviously the kind of $1 million question, isn't it? And
Not to put you on the spot, but could you just polish off your crystal ball there?
yeah, exactly. What was it? Predictions are very hard to make, particularly ones about the future. I think that was.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're kind of fortunate because you and I are speaking now, sort of mid-November, and we have the benefit of the recent midterm elections behind us. And we can kind of glean a lot from that. So just sort of for the setup for your readers. And by the way, I write about this from the front lines down here on Substack with notes from the end of the world. So do check out those essays where I cover all this. But what we've seen is sort of the first 2 years where you're absolutely right, Ronan. There's a lot of rice bowls to be broken down here. There was a huge and putrefied leviathan to be hacked up by that trademark chainsaw. So a lot of people had their noses put out of joint. A lot of people were feeding at the trough, and a lot of people, they call them gnocchis down here, which is that type of pasta that people eat here on the 28th day of every month, just before their next paycheck comes in, when they're kind of down to the raw bones. And they call those kind of do-nothing public disservice gnocchis. That is, those who only show up on the 28th to collect their paycheck. Anyway, that's been cut all the way down. And so a lot of people were, none too happy about that. But we've seen not only the Argentine people who voted resoundingly to continue on the path of progress that Milei has set out for the country, but also we've seen interest from other notable trading partners around the world. And I refer here, of course, to the United States, the single largest consumer economy per capita on the planet. Mr. Trump, like him or loathe him, has been an avid supporter of Senor Milei's. And what that essentially means is that Milei has been able to parlay his domestic agenda of cutting government down to size and opening the market up, both domestically and internationally, into some fairly remarkable political wins on, as far as inking trade deals. And I was just reading this as we're about to talk this morning. I'm just going to read the headline out here. This is from this morning's Buenos Aires Times. United States and Argentina reached deal to open markets on key goods. It says nations will open their markets to each other on key products, according to the White House statement. Argentina will provide preferential market access for US goods and exports, including medicines, chemicals, machinery, information technology, medical device. The list goes on here. So essentially what you've seen is, it's good to have friends in high places, but if you want a strategic geopolitical partner and a trading partner with a fairly voracious demand, as the U.S. consumer is famed for having around the world, this is a very, very bright move, and it portends very, very well for the continued economic revival here in Argentina. And I will just say, geopolitically speaking, this, as you mentioned at the top of our conversation here, Argentina, it's not like the Middle East, it's not like Eastern Europe, it's not in a kind of war zone, but there are unfriendly neighbors. There's Venezuela at the top of the continent. There's been, of course, rattlings from Petro in Colombia. There's Lula up in Brazil is not particularly friendly to the United States. Argentina down here at the end of the world is remodeling its constitution on the founding documents of the United States. So Juan Bautista Alberti, who drafted the Constitution in the middle of the 19th century for Argentina, modeled it on Jefferson's documents. And the Ley de Bases, which Milei has reintroduced and has had passed in the Congress here, is really taking the country back to essentially what the founding fathers envisioned for the United States 250 years ago. And obviously we've seen what's happened in the unfolding centuries in the US. I think we're at that point here where if he can deliver even a fraction of the potential that Argentina offers, then we could be looking at a multi-generation growth story for opportunity. And for those amongst us who care about personal liberties, that's a very happy side benefit to boot.
Yeah, absolutely, Joel. And, I would add to all of that, and, for any economic transformation, but real estate in particular, those demographics of Argentina are just so positive. They are unlike any other, let's call it quasi middle income country on earth. And that's before you look at returning diaspora. And, another thing, so this is kind of where I'm at. If you love BA and you love the idea of an apartment in BA, your downside risk is probably very, very little, barring this whole thing winding up in some catastrophic civil war or something, which seems highly unlikely. Real estate prices are about as low as they're going to get. Sure, they've bumped a bit in the last kind of 12, 18 months, but from crazy low bases. So your downside risk is pretty low. The journey I'm on is trying to understand if or how or under what scenarios this becomes a broader RETA recommendation, which is just
Mm.
get on the plane, go down there and buy. Even if you don't like BA, you're going to make a ton of money. And with your help, we're nudging along on that process. And of course, delighted you'll be joining us at the gathering in Panama. I
Brilliant.
I don't know how we're going to create a window in the gathering schedule big enough, because we just have so much to talk about, from those stakes, from those beautiful buildings, from the macro story. And of course you have devoted your life to studying from a ringside seat this transformation, and it all plays out in your Substack. So, RETA members, if you're not already following Joel on Substack, we'll include a link. Do it, you won't regret it. And please, if you can, give him that 1 cup of coffee a month or whatever it is for the paid Substack, because I really want us to keep him there and keep this independent, pragmatic, and live reporting. No one else on earth is giving me the window into Argentina that Joel is. So I'm particularly appreciative of that. So great stuff, Joel. Let's keep talking, and please send us videos from your touring around Buenos Aires. And excited to see you in person in Panama, in a shiny building where we can turn our noses up at these modern constructions.
No, absolutely. Thanks for the invitation too, mate. I'm really excited. It's been years since I've been to Panama, so I'm very much looking forward to that. And in the meantime, I will do the very, very difficult due diligence of heading out to a local parrilla so I can take a video of a nice bulbous glass of fat-bottomed Malbec and a thick, juicy steak to send your way.
Well, I'm getting hungry. It's earlier here in Guadalajara than it is there in BA, but your mention of that steak has my tummy grumbling already. So, listen, lovely, a pleasure to chat as always, Joel, and looking forward to seeing you and catching up in person in Panama.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Ronan, and thank you very much to your readers for taking a little bit of time with us today.